Have you ever experienced a moment so devastating that it splits your life into two distinct parts? The before and the after? I'm talking about one of those moments where time stops, your heart shatters, and you realize that the person you trusted most in the world is capable of cruelty you never imagined. For me, that moment came when I was lying in a hospital bed, exhausted from 14 hours of labor, holding my newborn son for the first time. And my husband of 8 years looked me straight in the eyes and said those 4 words that destroyed everything. He's not mine. Picture this scene with me. You've just gone through the most physically and emotionally intense experience of your life. Your body's broken, you're bleeding, you can barely sit up. And you're holding this tiny, perfect human being that you've been growing inside you for 9 months. The love you feel is overwhelming, pure. The kind of love that makes you understand why people say having a child changes everything. And then the man who promised to love you in sickness and in health, who held your hand through morning sickness, who felt the baby kick, who drove you to the hospital when your water broke, suddenly becomes a stranger, a cruel stranger who chooses the moment of your greatest vulnerability to deliver the most devastating blow possible. I'm Rebecca. I'm 50 years old, and I live in Denver, Colorado. Today, I'm retired from my career as a registered nurse, and I have 2 beautiful children who are now in their 20s, a cozy apartment filled with plants and books. And for the first time in decades, I wake up every morning without fear. But 5 years ago, I was a completely different person. I was a woman so broken, so gaslighted, so convinced that I was the problem in my marriage, that when my husband accused me of cheating while I was holding our newborn baby, a tiny part of me actually wondered if somehow, impossibly, he might be right. Before I dive deeper into this story, and trust me, what I'm about to tell you gets much worse before it gets better. I want you to do something for me. I want you to leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Are you in your bedroom late at night wondering if you're crazy? Are you in your car during lunch break, trying to make sense of your own relationship? Wherever you are, know that you're not alone. And if this story resonates with you, if you see pieces of your own life in what I'm sharing, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Every subscription tells me that someone out there needs to hear these stories, needs to know that survival is possible, that healing is real. The story I'm about to tell you spans 22 years of my life. 22 years of psychological warfare that I didn't even recognize as abuse until I was almost broken beyond repair. Because here's what nobody tells you about narcissistic abuse. It doesn't start with obvious cruelty. It starts with love, or what feels like love. It starts with someone who seems too good to be true, who makes you feel like the most special person in the world, who promises you a fairy tale life. And by the time you realize that the fairy tale is actually a nightmare, you're so deep in their web of manipulation that you can't tell up from down anymore. That accusation in the hospital room, that wasn't the beginning of his cruelty. That was just the moment when his mask finally slipped completely off. The truth is, David had been systematically destroying my sense of reality for years before our son was born. He had been so methodical, so calculated in his emotional abuse, that by the time he accused me of infidelity while I was holding our baby, I was already a shell of who I used to be. And the most terrifying part? I had no idea it was happening. I met David when I was 23 years old, fresh out of nursing school and working my first job at Denver General Hospital. I was young, ambitious, and admittedly naive about relationships. I'd had a few boyfriends in college, nothing serious, and I was focused on building my career. I loved being a nurse. There was something about helping people in their most vulnerable moments that gave my life meaning. I was good at it too. My supervisor had already mentioned the possibility of a promotion, and I was considering going back to school for my master's degree. It was a Tuesday evening in March when everything changed. I was leaving the hospital after a particularly long shift in the emergency room. I was exhausted, my feet were killing me, and all I wanted was to go home, take a hot bath, and order Chinese takeout. As I walked to my car in the parking garage, I heard footsteps behind me. Now, as a woman walking alone at night, this immediately put me on alert. But when I turned around, I saw this incredibly handsome man in an expensive suit, holding what looked like flowers. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was smooth, confident. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I've been watching you for the past week, and I couldn't leave tonight without at least introducing myself." He held out the flowers, a beautiful bouquet of white roses. "I'm David. I work at the law firm across the street, and every day around this time I see you leaving the hospital. You have this look on your face, like you've just saved someone's life, and I find it absolutely captivating." I should have been creeped out, a stranger admitting he'd been watching me for a week. That's stalker behavior, right? But somehow, the way he said it, the genuine smile on his face, the expensive suit that suggested success and stability, it didn't feel threatening. It felt romantic, like something out of a movie. No one had ever given me flowers before, let alone a man who looked like he'd stepped off the cover of a magazine. "That's very sweet," I said, accepting the roses. "They smelled incredible. But how did you know I work here? And how long have you really been watching me?" I was trying to be cautious, but I was already charmed. He had these piercing blue eyes, and this way of looking at me like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever encountered. "I promise I'm not a stalker." He laughed, and the sound was warm, infectious. "I'm a corporate lawyer. I work late most nights, and I park in this same garage. For the past week, I've been timing my departure just so I might run into you. I kept telling myself I'd introduce myself, but every time I saw you, I lost my nerve. You're incredibly beautiful, and you have this aura of competence and caring that just drew me in. Tonight, I decided I couldn't let another opportunity pass by." We talked for 20 minutes in that parking garage. He told me about his work, asked about mine with genuine interest, and made me laugh more than I had in months. When he asked if he could take me to dinner the following Friday, I said yes, without hesitation. I drove home that night feeling like I was floating. This successful, gorgeous man had been watching me, had been planning how to meet me, had brought me flowers. It felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. Our first date was at the most expensive restaurant in downtown Denver. David picked me up in a BMW, opened every door for me, and had clearly put thought into every detail. He'd remembered that I mentioned loving Italian food during our brief conversation, so he'd made reservations at this exclusive place that I'd only heard about but never dreamed of being able to afford on my nurse's salary. He ordered wine that cost more than I made in a day, and he insisted on ordering for both of us, saying he knew the menu well and wanted to make sure I experienced the best the restaurant had to offer. Throughout dinner, David was the perfect gentleman. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, my family, my dreams. He seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. When I mentioned that I was considering graduate school, he immediately started talking about how important it was for women to pursue their ambitions, how impressed he was by my dedication to helping others. He had this way of making me feel like I was the most interesting, most accomplished person in the room. But what really got me was how he talked about his own life. He'd grown up poor, he said, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. He'd put himself through law school, worked his way up from nothing, and now he was a partner at one of the most prestigious firms in the city. He spoke about his mother with such reverence, such respect for strong women. He said he'd been looking for someone who shared his values, someone who understood the importance of hard work and helping others. Someone like me. By the end of that first date, I was completely smitten. When he walked me to my apartment door and kissed me goodnight, it was gentle, respectful, perfect. He didn't try to come inside, didn't pressure me for anything more. He just held my face in his hands and said, "Rebecca, I hope you'll let me see you again. Tonight has been the best evening I've had in years." I called my best friend Sarah the moment I got inside. "I think I just met my future husband," I told her. And I wasn't even joking. David seemed too good to be true. Successful, handsome, respectful, interested in me for all the right reasons. After years of dating guys who seemed intimidated by my career or only interested in casual relationships, here was a man who appreciated my ambition and seemed ready for something serious. The next morning, I woke up to find a huge arrangement of flowers waiting outside my apartment door with a note. "Thank you for the most wonderful evening. I can't wait to see you again. David." No man had ever made such an effort for me. I felt like I was living in a romantic comedy. The flowers kept coming. Every few days there would be another arrangement at my door, at the hospital reception desk, sometimes delivered to the nurse's station with notes that made my co-workers swoon. "To the angel who saves lives," one read. "Thinking of you every moment," said another. My colleagues started calling me the lucky one, and I have to admit, I was basking in all the attention. No one had ever pursued me with such intensity, such romantic gestures. David and I started seeing each other 3 or 4 times a week. He would pick me up after my shifts, take me to expensive restaurants, surprise me with weekend getaways to mountain resorts. Within a month, he was talking about how he'd never felt this way about anyone before, how I was different from all the other women he'd dated. He said I was pure, genuine, not materialistic like the women in his social circle. He made me feel special, chosen, like I was somehow above other women because I had a real profession and cared about helping people. But looking back now, I can see that the red flags were there from the very beginning. I just chose to interpret them as signs of his deep love for me, instead of warning signals. The first one should have been obvious. About 6 weeks into our relationship, I went out for drinks with my nursing school friends, something we did every Friday night. It was our tradition, our way of decompressing after long weeks at different hospitals around the city. I'd told David about it, and he'd seemed fine with it. Even said it sounded fun, and that he hoped I'd have a good time. But when I got home that night around 11, my phone was buzzing with missed calls and text messages from him. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering? I'm worried something happened to you." When I called him back, he sounded frantic, almost panicked. He said he'd driven by my apartment twice and hadn't seen my car, that he'd been imagining all sorts of terrible scenarios. I felt guilty for making him worry, and when he said he just cared about me so much that the thought of something happening to me made him sick, I found it touching rather than concerning. "I'm sorry," I said. "I should have called to let you know I'd be late. I didn't think about how you might worry." And that was the beginning of a pattern that would define our entire relationship. Him expressing concern that felt like love, and me apologizing for things that shouldn't have required an apology. The next Friday, when I mentioned my plans to go out with the girls again, David suggested that maybe we could do something together instead. "I miss you during the week," he said. "I hardly get to see you because of our work schedules. Friday nights could be our time." When I hesitated, he quickly added, "Of course, if you'd rather go out with your friends, I understand. I just thought it might be nice to have a regular date night, just the two of us." The way he phrased it made me feel like I was choosing my friends over him, like I was being selfish by wanting to maintain my friendships. So I canceled with the girls that week, and the next week, and before I knew it, Friday night drinks with my nursing school friends became a thing of the past. When Sarah asked me why I kept canceling, I told her that David and I were still in the honeymoon phase, that I wanted to spend as much time with him as possible. She raised an eyebrow but didn't push it. The comments about my appearance started subtly, too. David would compliment me constantly, but there was always a small criticism wrapped inside the praise. "You're so beautiful," he'd say. "But you know what would look amazing on you? If you grew your hair out a little longer. Short hair is cute, but you have such a gorgeous face. Longer hair would really frame it perfectly. Or, "You look stunning in that dress, but red is definitely your color. You should wear it more often instead of all that black. Black is so harsh against your skin tone." At first, I took these as helpful suggestions from someone who cared about me and wanted me to look my best. David had impeccable taste, expensive clothes, a beautiful apartment. He clearly knew about style and fashion in a way that I, someone who lived in scrubs most of the time, didn't. So I started growing my hair out. I bought more red clothes. I began to see my previous choices as somehow wrong or inadequate. The real turning point came about 3 months into our relationship. I'd been accepted into a graduate program that would allow me to become a nurse practitioner while continuing to work part-time. It was something I'd been working toward for years, and when the acceptance letter came, I was over the moon. I called David immediately to share the good news. His reaction wasn't what I expected. There was a long pause on the phone, and then he said, "Wow, that's a big commitment. Are you sure you want to take on that much stress? Graduate school while working? That sounds overwhelming." When I told him I was excited about the challenge, that I'd been planning this for years, he sighed. "I just worry about you, Rebecca. You already work such long hours, you're always exhausted. Adding school on top of that? When would we ever see each other?" Later that evening, he came over with takeout from my favorite restaurant and seemed much more supportive. He apologized for his initial reaction, said he was just worried about my health and our relationship, but of course he wanted me to pursue my dreams. But then he started asking practical questions that planted seeds of doubt. How much would the program cost? How many years would it take? Would I have to do clinical rotations at different hospitals? What if I had to move for a residency program? "I'm not trying to discourage you," he said, holding my hands across my small kitchen table. "I just want to make sure you've thought through all the implications. I love how ambitious you are. It's one of the things that attracted me to you. But I also love spending time with you, and I can't help but worry that this program will consume your life for the next few years. What happens to us during that time?" By the end of that conversation, what had started as excitement about my future had transformed into anxiety about whether I was making the right choice. David had a way of asking questions that seemed reasonable on the surface, but somehow made me question my own judgment. Was I being impractical? Was I prioritizing my career over our relationship? Was I taking on more than I could handle? I ended up deferring my acceptance for a year. David was thrilled. He said it showed how thoughtful and wise I was, how I understood the importance of timing. He promised that he'd support me completely when I did decide to go back to school, that we'd figure out a way to make it work. But somehow, that conversation never happened again. Every time I brought up reapplying, there was always a reason why it wasn't quite the right time. 6 months into our relationship, David proposed. It was everything a woman could dream of. A surprise weekend trip to Aspen, a candlelit dinner at a restaurant overlooking the mountains, a stunning diamond ring that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. He got down on one knee and gave this beautiful speech about how I was his soulmate, how he couldn't imagine his life without me, how he wanted to spend forever making me as happy as I'd made him. I said yes, of course. How could I not? This successful, handsome man was offering me the fairy tale life I'd always dreamed of. When we got back to Denver and started telling people our news, everyone was thrilled for me. My parents loved David. He was charming, respectful, and clearly financially stable. My coworkers were envious. Sarah was happy for me but kept making jokes about how fast everything was moving. 6 months, Rebecca? Are you sure you know him well enough to marry him? But I was so caught up in the romance of it all that I brushed off her concerns. The wedding planning became David's obsession. At first, I thought it was sweet how involved he wanted to be. Most of my married friends complained that their fiancés couldn't care less about wedding details. But David had opinions about everything. He wanted to be involved in choosing the venue, the flowers, the menu, even my dress. "This is the most important day of our lives," he'd say. I want everything to be perfect for you." But his involvement quickly became overwhelming. He had very specific ideas about what our wedding should look like, and somehow my preferences kept getting overruled. I wanted a small ceremony with close family and friends. David insisted we needed something grander, more befitting his position at the law firm. I wanted wildflowers and a simple outdoor ceremony. David said that would look too casual, and booked us at the most exclusive country club in the city. When I protested that we couldn't afford such an expensive venue on my salary, he brushed me off. "Don't worry about money, baby. I can handle the finances. This is an investment in our future." The guest list became a major source of tension. David wanted to invite his entire law firm, plus clients, plus his fraternity brothers from law school. When I suggested that maybe we should trim the list to people who were actually close to us, he looked at me like I'd suggested something ridiculous. "Rebecca, networking is crucial in my profession. These people expect to be invited to important events in my life. This isn't just about us, it's about my career, our future. My friends from nursing school barely made the cut." David found reasons to question almost all of them. Sarah was too negative and jealous of our happiness. My friend Jennifer was clearly dealing with some serious personal issues because she'd recently gone through a difficult breakup. My colleague Maria was inappropriate because she'd had a few too many drinks at a hospital holiday party and had been a little loud. One by one, my guest list got smaller, while his got bigger. The worst part was how he started monitoring my spending. Before we got engaged, David had been incredibly generous, always picking up checks, buying me gifts, insisting I shouldn't worry about money when we went out. But suddenly he was very interested in my financial habits. He suggested that since we were getting married, we should start managing our money together. "It's good practice for marriage," he said. "We should be transparent about everything." It started with him asking to see my bank statements and credit card bills. He said he wanted to help me budget for the wedding expenses and make sure we were being smart about our spending. But his review of my finances turned into a critique of every purchase I'd made. Why did I need to buy lunch at the hospital cafeteria when I could pack a sandwich? Why was I spending money on magazines when there was a library right downtown? Why did I need new scrubs when the ones I had were perfectly fine? "I'm not trying to control you," he'd say when I got defensive. "I'm trying to help you see that you could be more financially responsible. Once we're married, we'll be a team, and teams communicate about important things like money. I just want us to start our marriage on solid financial ground." The scrutiny extended beyond money. David started showing up at the hospital unexpectedly, sometimes bringing me lunch, sometimes just stopping by to say hello. At first, my co-workers thought it was romantic. "You're so lucky," they'd say. "He can't even go a day without seeing you." But I started feeling like I was being monitored. He'd ask detailed questions about who I'd talked to that day, which doctors I'd worked with, whether any of the male nurses had been friendly with me. When I mentioned that Dr. Martinez, one of the emergency room physicians, had complimented my work on a difficult case, David's mood shifted immediately. "Dr. Martinez? How old is he? Is he married? That seems like an inappropriate comment for a doctor to make to a nurse." When I tried to explain that it was a professional compliment about my clinical skills, David shook his head. "Rebecca, you're incredibly naive about men. You think he was complimenting your nursing abilities. He was flirting with you. You need to be more careful about encouraging that kind of behavior." I started second-guessing every interaction I had at work. Was Dr. Martinez flirting with me? Had I somehow encouraged inappropriate attention? David had so much more experience with professional relationships than I did. Maybe I was being naive. Maybe I needed to be more careful about how I interacted with my male colleagues. The isolation became more systematic as our wedding date approached. David suggested that since we'd be starting our married life together, maybe it was time for me to distance myself from influences that might be harmful to our relationship. Sarah in particular was a problem. She's single, Rebecca, and she's jealous of what we have. Single women often try to sabotage their friends' relationships because they can't stand to see them happy. I've seen it happen before. When I defended Sarah, pointing out that she'd been my friend since nursing school and had always been supportive, David sighed. I know you want to see the best in people, and that's one of the things I love about you. But I'm older, I have more experience with these situations. Sarah makes little comments designed to make you doubt our relationship. She questions how fast we're moving. She makes jokes about how I'm too good to be true. She plants seeds of doubt in your mind. A real friend would be happy for you and supportive of your choices. The night before our wedding, I had dinner with Sarah and a few other friends from nursing school. It was supposed to be my bachelorette party, but David had convinced me that a big party would be inappropriate and stressful so close to the wedding. Instead, we went to a quiet restaurant, just the four of us. During dinner, Sarah pulled me aside. Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Are you happy? Really, truly happy? Because you seem different lately. More anxious, more, I don't know, like you're walking on eggshells. And David, he's charming. But there's something about the way he looks at you, like he's keeping track of everything you say and do. It makes me uncomfortable. I felt a surge of anger that surprised me. How dare she question my relationship the night before my wedding? How dare she try to plant doubts in my mind when I was about to marry the most wonderful man I'd ever met? Sarah, I'm getting married tomorrow to an amazing man who loves me and wants to build a life with me. I'm sorry if you can't be happy for me. But David was right about you. You are jealous, and you are trying to sabotage my happiness. The hurt in her eyes was immediate and devastating, but I was too angry to take back my words. She left the restaurant that night, and I never spoke to her again. At my wedding the next day, I noticed her absence like a missing tooth, but I told myself it was her choice to miss the most important day of my life because she couldn't support my happiness. Our honeymoon in Hawaii was like something out of a magazine. David had spared no expense. 5-star resort, oceanfront suite, helicopter tours, swimming with dolphins. For 2 weeks, I felt like I was living someone else's life. David was attentive, romantic, constantly telling me how happy I made him, how perfect our life together was going to be. He took hundreds of photos of us, always making sure I looked perfect before he'd take the shot. I want to remember every moment of this, he'd say. I want to capture how beautiful you are, how happy we are together. But even during our honeymoon, there were small moments that should have concerned me. When we were at dinner one night, our waiter was a young man about our age, who was friendly and chatty. He was from Colorado, too, and when he found out we were on our honeymoon, he was enthusiastic and congratulatory. After he left our table, David's mood shifted. That waiter was flirting with you, he said. Did you see how he kept looking at you? How he found excuses to come back to our table? When I protested that he was just being friendly and good at his job, David shook his head. Rebecca, you really need to learn to pick up on these things. Just because we're married doesn't mean other men are going to stop trying to get your attention. You need to be more aware. I started paying closer attention to my interactions with service workers for the rest of our trip, second-guessing every smile, every polite conversation. Was I somehow encouraging inappropriate attention? Was I being naive about men's intentions? David seemed so sure, so confident in his interpretation of these interactions that I began to doubt my own perceptions. When we returned from Hawaii, real life set in quickly. We moved into David's apartment, which was beautiful but felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was expensive, perfectly arranged, and I was terrified of disturbing anything. David had very specific ideas about how things should be organized, and he was patient but persistent in teaching me his systems. I know it seems rigid, he'd say, but there's a place for everything, and everything should be in its place. It makes life so much easier when you know exactly where things belong. Within a month of our marriage, David suggested that I should quit my job at the hospital. "We don't need the money," he said. "My salary is more than enough for both of us, and I hate the idea of you working those long hours, dealing with all that stress. You come home exhausted, sometimes upset about losing a patient or dealing with difficult doctors. I want you to be happy, relaxed. Maybe you could find something part-time, something less demanding." The idea terrified me. Nursing wasn't just my job. It was my identity, my passion. I'd worked so hard to get where I was, and I loved helping people, loved the challenges and rewards of hospital work. But David painted such a picture of our potential life together. I could pursue hobbies, maybe do some volunteer work, focus on making our home beautiful. We could travel more, spend more time together. "Think about it," he said. "When we have children, you'll want to be home with them anyway. This could be practice for that. Children." We'd talked about having a family, but always in vague terms. Now David was talking about it like it was an immediate plan. "I'd love to start trying right away," he said. "I want to be a young father. I want to have the energy to play with my kids, to be really involved in their lives. And you'd be such an amazing mother, Rebecca. You have such a nurturing spirit." I wasn't ready for children yet. We'd been married for 2 months, and I felt like I was still adjusting to married life, to living with David, to having someone else's opinions and preferences constantly influencing my decisions. But David was so enthusiastic about the idea, so sure that this was what we both wanted, that I found myself going along with it. When I mentioned that maybe we should wait a year or 2, get more settled, David looked disappointed. "Why wait? We love each other. We're financially stable. We both want children. What's the benefit of postponing something wonderful?" I stopped taking birth control without really making a conscious decision about it. David was so happy, so excited about the possibility of starting our family, that I got swept up in his enthusiasm. When I got pregnant just 3 months after our wedding, David was over the moon. He immediately started making plans, talking about converting his home office into a nursery, researching the best schools in the area, discussing whether we should buy a house. Pregnancy was when David's controlling behavior really intensified, but he framed it all as concern for my health and the baby's well-being. He researched everything obsessively: what I should eat, what exercises were safe, what products were harmful to developing babies. He threw away all my beauty products and replaced them with expensive organic alternatives. He monitored my diet carefully, making sure I was getting enough protein, enough vegetables, enough water. "I just want to make sure you and the baby have everything you need," he'd say, when I protested that he was being overly cautious. The problem was that David's research often contradicted what my doctor was telling me. When my obstetrician said it was fine for me to continue working until my 3rd trimester, David disagreed. "Dr. Peterson is old school," he said. "He doesn't stay current with the latest research. I've been reading studies that show stress hormones can affect fetal development. Your job is incredibly stressful. Think about what's best for our baby." I ended up quitting my job when I was 5 months pregnant, telling myself it was temporary, that I'd go back to work when the baby was older. David was thrilled. "Now you can focus completely on growing our beautiful baby," he said. "You don't have to worry about anything except staying healthy and happy." But without my job, I felt lost. I'd been working since I was 16 years old. I didn't know how to fill my days without the structure and purpose that work provided. I tried to enjoy my free time, but I felt guilty relaxing when David was working such long hours to support us. I started having breakfast ready when he left for work, dinner ready when he came home. I kept the apartment spotless, did all the laundry, handled all the household tasks. It seemed like the least I could do since I wasn't contributing financially anymore. David was appreciative of my efforts, but he also had specific expectations about how things should be done. The way I folded his shirts wasn't quite right. The meals I cooked were good, but maybe I could try some new recipes, something more sophisticated. The apartment was clean, but certain tasks needed to be done more frequently. "I'm not criticizing," he'd always say. "I'm just trying to help you do things more efficiently." The social isolation that had started during our engagement became complete during my pregnancy. My former co-workers tried to stay in touch, but David discouraged me from maintaining those friendships. "You're in such a different place in your life now," he'd say. "They're all single, focused on their careers, going out to bars after work. You don't have anything in common with them anymore. It's natural for friendships to evolve as people's lives change." When my old nursing school friends invited me to baby showers or birthday parties, David would find reasons why I shouldn't go. I was too tired. The drive was too long. Being around crowds wasn't good for the baby. He was so concerned, so protective that I started declining invitations without even discussing them with him. It was easier than dealing with his worry and his very reasonable-sounding objections. My parents lived 3 hours away, and visits became increasingly rare. David found my mother intrusive, and my father judgmental. When they did visit, David would be polite but cold, and I could feel the tension in the air. After they left, he'd point out all the ways they'd overstepped boundaries or made inappropriate comments. "Your mother keeps giving you unsolicited advice about the pregnancy," he'd say. "She acts like she knows better than your doctor. And your father barely speaks to me. It's like he doesn't approve of me or our marriage." I started seeing my parents less and less, telling myself that David was right, that they were being intrusive, that it was normal for a married couple to prioritize their immediate family over their extended family. When my mother called to express concern that I seemed isolated, that I'd changed since getting married, I felt defensive and angry. David was right. They didn't understand our relationship, didn't appreciate how lucky I was to have such a devoted husband. Our son, Michael, was born on a snowy December morning, and for a few hours I felt like I was in heaven, holding him for the first time, seeing David's face light up when he looked at our baby. It felt like all the sacrifices I'd made had been worth it. David was incredibly attentive during my recovery, bringing me flowers, taking care of all the hospital paperwork, making sure I had everything I needed. For those first few days, he seemed like the perfect father and husband. But that moment of pure joy didn't last long. As we were preparing to leave the hospital, David looked down at Michael sleeping in my arms and said something that stopped my heart cold. "He doesn't look like me at all, does he?" There was something in his tone, something sharp and suspicious that made my blood run cold. When I pointed out that newborns often don't look like anyone in particular, that he had David's nose and my eyes, David just stared at me with this calculating expression I'd never seen before. "It's just interesting," he said finally, "how little he resembles me. I mean, I know genetics can be unpredictable, but still." He let the sentence hang in the air, and I felt like I was going to be sick. Was he suggesting what I thought he was suggesting? After everything we'd been through, after the way he'd controlled every aspect of my pregnancy, was he actually questioning whether Michael was his son? When I confronted him about it later that day, David immediately backtracked. "Of course he's mine," he said, holding me close. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm just overwhelmed. New father nerves, you know? I love him so much it scares me. Please forget I said anything." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I could see it in his eyes when he looked at Michael. There was love there, yes, but there was also suspicion, like he was constantly looking for evidence of something. The early months of motherhood were the hardest of my life. Michael was a difficult baby, colicky, a terrible sleeper, constantly fussy. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and completely unprepared for how demanding caring for a newborn would be. David, meanwhile, seemed to glide through it all effortlessly. When Michael cried at night, David would often sleep right through it, leaving me to handle all the nighttime feedings and diaper changes. When I'd mention how tired I was, he'd remind me that he had to work the next day, that his job was supporting our family, that my job was taking care of our home and baby. I'm not saying it's easy," he'd say when I broke down crying from exhaustion. "But this is what you wanted, Rebecca. You wanted to be a mother, to stay home with our children. I'm working 14-hour days to make that possible for you. The least you can do is handle the home front without constantly complaining." When Michael was 6 months old, I brought up the possibility of getting some part-time childcare help, maybe going back to work a few hours a week. I missed nursing, missed feeling competent and useful, missed having adult conversations about something other than diaper rash and feeding schedules. David's reaction was swift and harsh. "Absolutely not. We're not having strangers raise our son. And what kind of mother wants to abandon her baby to go back to work? I thought you understood that being a mother was a full-time job." The criticism stung because part of me did feel guilty for wanting something beyond motherhood. All the parenting books talked about how fulfilling and wonderful it was to be home with your children. But I felt trapped, isolated, like I was losing myself more every day. When I tried to explain this to David, he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Most women would be grateful to have a husband who can provide for them, so they don't have to work. Most women would appreciate having the luxury of staying home with their children instead of dumping them in daycare. Our daughter Emma was born when Michael was 2 years old, and by then, the pattern was firmly established. David was the provider, the decision-maker, the authority figure. I was the caretaker, the one responsible for everything domestic, everything child-related, everything that happened within the walls of our home. If the children were happy and well-behaved, it was because David was a good father and provider. If they were cranky or difficult, it was because I wasn't managing them properly. David had very specific ideas about how the children should be raised, and he wasn't interested in my input. Michael would play sports, baseball, football, soccer. Emma would take dance lessons and piano. They would attend the best private schools, participate in activities that would look good on college applications, be raised to be successful, ambitious, high-achieving. When I suggested that maybe we should let them try different activities and see what they were interested in, David dismissed the idea immediately. "Children don't know what's good for them," he said. "That's why they have parents. I'm not going to let my kids waste time on frivolous activities when they could be building skills that will serve them their entire lives." I tried to advocate for what the children wanted versus what David thought they should want. He'd accuse me of undermining his authority, of not supporting him as a co-parent. The most painful part was watching how David interacted with the children differently, depending on his mood and his relationship with me. When things were good between us, when I was being compliant and agreeable, David was warm and engaging with Michael and Emma. He'd play with them, read to them, take them on special outings. But when I displeased him in any way, when I questioned his decisions or pushed back against his control, the children somehow became part of his punishment of me. He'd plan special activities with them that deliberately excluded me. "Mommy can't come with us today," he'd tell them. "She's been very stressed lately, and she needs some time alone to think about how to be happier." He'd take them out for ice cream or to the park, and when they came home, they'd be full of stories about their wonderful time with Daddy, making me feel even more isolated and left out. When the children misbehaved, David would somehow make it my fault. If Michael had a tantrum, it was because I was too permissive with him. If Emma was clingy and didn't want to go to bed, it was because I was making her anxious with my own anxiety. "Children pick up on their mother's emotional state," he'd say. "If you were more calm and centered, they would be too." As the children got older, David started using them as messengers in our relationship. Instead of talking to me directly about issues, he'd mention them to Michael or Emma, knowing they'd repeat the conversation to me. "Daddy says you've been spending too much money at the grocery store," 5-year-old Michael announced one day. "He says we need to be more careful about our budget." Or Emma would come home from an outing with David and casually mention, Daddy says you used to be a nurse before you had us, but now your job is taking care of us and him. The worst manipulation came during our arguments. When I'd finally reach my breaking point and try to address David's behavior, his controlling tendencies, his constant criticism, he'd immediately bring the children into it. How can you say I'm a bad husband when I provide everything this family needs? Do you want to break up our children's home? Do you want Michael and Emma to grow up in a broken family because you're not happy? If I persisted in trying to discuss our problems, David would escalate the emotional manipulation. If you're so unhappy, maybe you should leave. But you need to understand that these are my children too, and I'm not going to let you take them away from me. I can provide for them in ways you never could. They need stability, not a mother who's constantly unhappy and wants to disrupt their lives because she can't appreciate what she has. The threat was always there, hovering beneath the surface of every disagreement. If I pushed too hard, if I demanded too much, if I tried to assert any independence or autonomy, I might lose my children. And by then, I'd been out of the workforce for so long, had no savings of my own, no support system, no confidence in my ability to survive on my own, that the threat felt very real and very terrifying. Bloco 6. Anos de manipulação. Y ciclos. 4,000 caracteres. The years that followed fell into a predictable, soul-crushing pattern that I didn't even recognize as abnormal until much later. David had perfected what I now know is called the cycle of abuse, though at the time I just thought of it as the natural ups and downs of marriage. There would be periods of relative peace, even happiness, followed by increasing tension, then an explosion of anger and criticism, and finally, a honeymoon period where David would be apologetic and loving again. The explosions were never physical. David was too smart for that, too aware of how that would look to the outside world. Instead, his anger came in the form of withering criticism, silent treatments that could last for days, and emotional manipulation that left me questioning my own sanity. He had an incredible ability to take any disagreement and turn it into evidence of my fundamental flaws as a wife and mother. If I questioned a financial decision he'd made, I was being disrespectful and undermining his role as the provider. If I suggested a different approach to disciplining the children, I was being inconsistent and confusing them. If I mentioned feeling lonely or isolated, I was being ungrateful for everything he'd given me. Every concern I raised, every need I expressed, every emotion I felt that wasn't complete happiness and gratitude, somehow became proof that I was the problem in our marriage. The silent treatments were the worst. David would simply stop speaking to me, stop acknowledging my presence, stop responding to anything I said. He'd interact normally with Michael and Emma, be charming and engaged with them, but treat me like I was invisible. The children would notice, of course, and ask why Daddy wasn't talking to Mommy. David would tell them that Mommy had hurt his feelings and needed to think about how to be kinder. During these periods, I'd find myself walking on eggshells, trying desperately to figure out what I'd done wrong and how to fix it. I'd cook his favorite meals, clean the house obsessively, take care of everything so he wouldn't have any reason to be upset with me. Sometimes the silent treatment would last a day, sometimes a week. It only ended when I apologized, usually for something I didn't fully understand and promised to do better. The honeymoon periods that followed were almost worse than the explosions because they gave me hope. David would be affectionate again, bring me flowers, plan romantic dinners, tell me how much he loved me and couldn't live without me. He'd promise that things would be different, that he'd try to be more patient, that we'd work together to improve our communication. For a few days or weeks, he'd be the charming, attentive man I'd fallen in love with, and I'd convince myself that we'd turned a corner. But the tension would always start building again. Small criticisms, little expressions of disappointment, subtle signs that I wasn't meeting his expectations. I became hypervigilant, constantly monitoring his moods, trying to anticipate what might set him off, adjusting my behavior to avoid conflict. I stopped expressing opinions that might contradict his. I stopped mentioning my own needs or wants. I became smaller and smaller, trying to take up less space, cause fewer problems. My mental health deteriorated slowly, so gradually that I didn't notice it happening. I started having panic attacks in the grocery store, overwhelmed by the simple task of choosing what to make for dinner, terrified of picking something David wouldn't like. I developed insomnia, lying awake at night replaying conversations, analyzing every word I'd said, wondering if I'd somehow offended him. I stopped looking in mirrors because I didn't recognize the anxious, hollow-eyed woman staring back at me. The few times I tried to reach out for help, David's reputation in the community worked against me. He was successful, respected, known for his charitable work and community involvement. When I mentioned to my doctor that I was feeling depressed and anxious, she suggested that it might be normal stress from raising 2 young children and recommended that I talk to my husband about getting more help at home. When I tried to confide in my neighbor, she reminded me how lucky I was to have such a devoted husband who worked so hard to provide for his family. David even started suggesting that I might need professional help for my mood issues. He'd research therapists and psychiatrists, always framing it as his concern for my well-being and our family's stability. "I just want you to be happy," he'd say. "But your constant anxiety and depression are affecting the children. Maybe talking to someone could help you develop better coping strategies." The message was clear. The problem was me, my inability to handle the normal stresses of life, my failure to appreciate the good life he'd given me. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I was 42 years old. Michael was 17, Emma was 15, and I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store, crying because I couldn't remember what David had told me to buy for dinner. I'd been standing in the produce section for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the fear of choosing the wrong vegetables, when I realized how completely insane my life had become. As I sat there, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Did you remember to get the organic broccoli? Not the regular kind. And make sure you get enough for leftovers. We talked about this." The casual condescension in that message, the assumption that I couldn't handle a simple grocery trip without detailed instructions, suddenly hit me like a physical blow. When had I become someone who needed permission to buy vegetables? I drove home that day in a daze, the groceries forgotten in my car. Instead of going inside, I sat in the driveway and really looked at my house for the first time in years. The perfect landscaping that David insisted on, the expensive cars, the pristine exterior that looked like something from a magazine. From the outside, we had the ideal life, so why did I feel like I was dying inside? That evening, while David was working late and the kids were doing homework, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got on the computer and started searching, not for recipes or household tips or children's activities, but for answers to questions I'd been afraid to ask. Why do I feel like I'm walking on eggshells in my marriage? Is it normal to be afraid of your husband's moods? What is emotional abuse? The articles I found that night were like reading about my own life written by strangers. The descriptions of emotional manipulation, gaslighting, isolation, control. It was all there, laid out in clinical terms that made my reality undeniable. For the first time in nearly 20 years, I had words for what was happening to me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't oversensitive. I wasn't the problem. The term narcissistic abuse appeared in article after article, and as I read about the patterns, the tactics, the cycle of idealization and devaluation, I felt like I was finally seeing clearly after decades of living in fog. The love bombing at the beginning of our relationship, the gradual isolation from friends and family, the way he'd twisted every argument to make me the villain, the silent treatments, the constant criticism disguised as help. It was all textbook narcissistic behavior. But the most shocking revelation was reading about something called trauma bonding. The articles explained how abuse victims often develop intense emotional attachments to their abusers, mistaking the relief after an abusive episode for love, confusing the highs and lows of the abuse cycle for passion. I thought about all the times I'd felt grateful to David after he'd stopped giving me the silent treatment, how I'd interpreted his occasional kindness as evidence of his deep love for me. I spent the next several weeks reading everything I could find about narcissistic abuse and recovery. I was careful to clear my browser history, to only research when David was at work, to act completely normal when he was home. But inside, I was undergoing a complete revolution. Every interaction with David became a case study in manipulation. I started recognizing his tactics in real time. The way he'd deflect when I brought up concerns. How he'd turn my words against me. The calculated nature of his emotional responses. The hardest part was realizing how much damage had been done to my relationship with my children. I could see how David had systematically undermined my authority with them. How he'd positioned himself as the fun parent while making me the disciplinarian. How he'd used them as weapons against me during our conflicts. Michael and Emma had learned to navigate around David's moods just like I had. And I felt sick thinking about the example we'd been setting for them, about what relationships should look like. One evening, about a month into my research, Emma came to me crying because David had criticized her performance in a school play. She'd been so excited about getting the lead role, but David had focused entirely on the one moment where she'd forgotten a line. I just don't understand why nothing I do is ever good enough for him. She sobbed, and I felt like a knife was twisting in my chest. My 15-year-old daughter was already experiencing the same self-doubt and anxiety that had consumed me for decades. That night, I made a decision that terrified me, but felt absolutely necessary. I was going to leave David, not next month or next year, but as soon as I could figure out how to do it safely and protect my children in the process. I didn't know how I'd support myself after being out of the workforce for so long. I didn't know where we'd live or how I'd handle the legal battle that would surely follow. But I knew that staying meant watching my children learn to accept emotional abuse as normal, and I couldn't live with that. Planning my escape felt like preparing for war. I knew that David would not let me go easily, and I'd read enough about narcissistic abuse to understand that the period when a victim tries to leave is often the most dangerous time. Not physically dangerous in my case. David had never hit me, but psychologically and legally dangerous. He had all the resources, all the connections, all the financial power. I had nothing but determination and a growing understanding of what I was up against. The first thing I did was start documenting everything. I bought a small notebook that I kept hidden in my bedroom closet, and every day I wrote down David's behaviors, his controlling actions, the things he said to me and the children. I recorded the dates of his silent treatments, his emotional outbursts, his attempts to undermine my relationship with Michael and Emma. I took photos of text messages where he was particularly condescending or controlling. I needed evidence, proof that what was happening wasn't normal, wasn't acceptable. Money was my biggest obstacle. I hadn't worked in over 15 years, and David controlled all of our finances completely. I didn't even know how much money we had or where our accounts were. But I started being more observant, paying attention when he did online banking, noting account numbers and passwords when I could. I began saving small amounts of cash whenever possible. Money from returning items at stores, finding loose change, asking for cash back at the grocery store and pocketing some of it. I also started researching my legal rights. I learned about divorce laws in our state, about custody arrangements, about spousal support. The information was both encouraging and terrifying. I would likely be entitled to half of our assets and spousal support, since I'd been out of the workforce, caring for our children. But I also learned that David could make the process incredibly difficult and expensive, especially if he hired the kind of high-powered attorneys his law firm had access to. The hardest part was figuring out how to protect Michael and Emma through all of this. They were teenagers now, old enough to have opinions about custody arrangements, but they'd been conditioned their entire lives to see David as the provider. the authority figure, the parent who gave them opportunities and advantages. I was the parent who worried too much, who restricted their freedom, who couldn't provide for them the way David could. I started having careful conversations with them about relationships, about respect, about what healthy communication looked like. When David would criticize me in front of them, I began gently pointing out that his behavior wasn't acceptable. "It's not okay for people to speak to each other that way," I'd say quietly after he'd leave the room. "Even when we're married, even when we're family, we should treat each other with respect." Emma was more receptive to these conversations than Michael. She'd experienced David's criticism firsthand and was starting to recognize that his standards were impossible to meet. But Michael idolized his father, wanted to follow in his footsteps, and saw my growing independence as disloyalty to the family. The thought of potentially losing my son's respect, of him choosing David over me in a custody battle, was almost enough to make me abandon my plans altogether. I knew I needed professional help, but I was terrified that David would find out if I went to a therapist. Instead, I started calling domestic violence hotlines, using the phone at the library, or calling from payphones when I was running errands. The counselors I spoke with helped me understand that what I was experiencing was indeed abuse, even though David had never hit me. They helped me develop safety plans and connected me with resources for women leaving abusive relationships. Through one of these hotlines, I was connected with a lawyer who specialized in cases involving domestic abuse. She agreed to meet with me for a consultation, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone truly understood the complexity of my situation. She explained how David's controlling behavior would be viewed by the courts, how his financial manipulation constituted economic abuse, how his treatment of me in front of the children could affect custody decisions. "The fact that you've been documenting everything is crucial," she told me. "And the fact that your children are teenagers means they'll have more say in custody arrangements. But you need to be prepared for this to be a long, difficult process. Men like your husband don't give up control easily, and they have resources to make divorce proceedings incredibly challenging." She helped me understand the steps I needed to take: opening my own bank account, getting copies of all financial documents, establishing my own credit, finding a place to live, planning for the children's immediate needs. It felt overwhelming, but for the first time in decades, I had a concrete plan for building a life outside of David's control. The most terrifying moment came when I almost got caught. I'd been careless about clearing my browser history after researching divorce attorneys, and David noticed. "Why were you looking at lawyers' websites?" he asked one evening, his voice deceptively casual. My heart started racing, but I managed to come up with an excuse about helping a friend who was having marital problems. He seemed to accept the explanation, but I noticed him watching me more carefully after that, checking my phone more frequently, asking more questions about where I'd been and who I'd talked to. The conversation that ended my marriage happened on a Saturday morning in March. David was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, working as usual, even on weekends. Michael was at baseball practice, Emma was at a friend's house, and for once, we were alone. I'd been planning this moment for months, rehearsing what I'd say, but my heart was still pounding as I sat down across from him. "David, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not happy in our marriage, and I think we need to consider counseling or separation." I decided to start with the counseling option, even though I knew it wouldn't work, because I wanted to give him a chance to respond reasonably. His reaction was immediate and predictable. First came the denial and minimization. "What are you talking about? We have a great life, Rebecca. You have everything most women would kill for. You're being dramatic and emotional, as usual." When I persisted, explaining that I felt controlled and diminished in our relationship, he shifted to anger. "After everything I've done for you, after all the sacrifices I've made to give you this life, this is how you repay me? I'd prepared for this response and I stayed calm. I'm not trying to attack you, David. I'm trying to save our marriage by being honest about how I feel. But if you're not willing to work on this together, then I think we need to separate. That's when the mask came completely off. David's face changed in a way I'd never seen before, his features twisting with rage and contempt. You want to leave me? You think you can just walk away from this marriage? From this family? Let me tell you something, Rebecca. You have nothing without me. No job, no money, no skills that anyone would want. You've been out of the workforce for so long that no hospital would hire you. You couldn't support yourself, let alone the children. The cruelty in his voice was breathtaking, but I'd been preparing for this too. I understand that it will be difficult, but I'm willing to figure it out. I just can't live like this anymore. I told him about the counseling resources I'd found, suggested that we could try a trial separation first, that maybe with some space and professional help we could work things out. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Counseling? You think some therapist is going to take your side against me? You think anyone is going to believe that you're the victim in this marriage? I'm a respected attorney, Rebecca. You're a housewife who's been out of touch with reality for so long that you've convinced yourself that your perfect life is somehow abusive. Then came the threats I'd been dreading. And if you think you're taking my children away from me, you're more delusional than I thought. Michael already thinks you're unstable. He's told me how embarrassing your anxiety attacks are, how you overreact to everything. Emma might feel sorry for you now, but wait until she understands that you're the one who destroyed our family because you couldn't appreciate what you had. He stood up from the table, towering over me, his voice getting louder. I will fight you for custody, Rebecca, and I will win. I have resources you can't even imagine. I have colleagues who will testify to your instability, your inability to make rational decisions. You'll be lucky to get supervised visitation when I'm done with you. But something had shifted in me during those months of preparation. Instead of crumbling under his threats the way I always had before, I felt a strange sense of calm. Then that's a risk I'll have to take, I said quietly, because staying here is killing me slowly, and I won't model this kind of relationship for our children anymore. The next few hours were a blur of his rage, his attempts to guilt me, his promises that things would change if I'd just give him another chance. But I'd heard all of it before, and I wasn't fooled anymore. By evening, I'd moved into the guest bedroom, and David had called his attorney. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. David alternated between trying to win me back with grand gestures and promises, and punishing me with cold rejection and legal threats. He told the children that I was having some kind of mental breakdown, that I was being selfish and destroying our family over imaginary problems. He hired the most aggressive divorce attorney in the city and began gathering ammunition to use against me in court. But I'd also taken action. I'd moved the small amount of money I'd saved into an account David couldn't access. I'd retained the attorney who specialized in abuse cases. I'd started documenting everything with even more precision, recording conversations when I could, keeping detailed records of his behavior toward me and the children. The hardest part was watching how the separation affected Michael and Emma. Michael was angry with me, convinced that I was destroying our family for selfish reasons. Emma was torn between loyalty to both parents, trying to play peacemaker while dealing with her own confusion and pain. I wanted to protect them from the ugliness of our divorce, but I also knew they needed to understand why I was making this choice. The divorce took 2 years to finalize, and they were the most difficult and liberating years of my life simultaneously. David fought me on everything: custody, finances, even the furniture. He hired investigators to try to prove I was mentally unstable, questioned every decision I made regarding the children, and attempted to portray me as an unfit mother who'd abandoned her family for selfish reasons. But something amazing happened during that process. The more David revealed his true nature in court, the clearer it became to everyone, including Michael and Emma. what our marriage had really been like, when his own attorney had to tell him to tone down his aggressive behavior during depositions, when the judge commented on his controlling tendencies, when Emma finally told the custody evaluator that she was afraid to disagree with her father about anything. The truth became undeniable. I went back to nursing, starting with a refresher course, and then working part-time at a small clinic. It was terrifying at first. I hadn't worked in over 15 years, and David's voice in my head kept telling me I wasn't capable, that I'd fail, that no one would want to hire me. But I was amazed by how quickly it came back to me, how good it felt to help people again, to use my skills, to have colleagues who treated me with respect and appreciation. The hardest part was rebuilding my relationship with my children. Michael struggled for a long time with anger toward me for breaking up the family. It took months of family therapy for him to understand that I hadn't destroyed our family. I'd saved us from continuing a destructive pattern. Emma adapted more quickly, but she had her own healing to do from years of walking on eggshells around David's moods. Today, 5 years later, I can honestly say that leaving David was the best decision I ever made. I live in a small apartment that's mine, filled with plants and books and things that make me happy. I have friends again, real friends who support me and enjoy my company without expecting anything in return. I've been promoted twice at the hospital where I work, and I'm considering going back to school for my master's degree, something I gave up decades ago. Michael is in college now, studying environmental science, and he's learned to have healthy disagreements and express his opinions without fear. Emma is a senior in high school, confident and strong-willed in ways that would have terrified David, but that fill me with pride. They both spend time with their father, but they also recognize his limitations and manipulation tactics in ways they never could when we were all living under the same roof. The most important thing I want you to understand is this. If any part of my story sounds familiar, if you recognize yourself in the woman I used to be, you are not crazy. You are not oversensitive. You are not asking for too much when you expect to be treated with respect and kindness by someone who claims to love you. Emotional abuse is real abuse, even when there are no bruises, even when he provides for you financially, even when everyone else thinks you have the perfect life. I need you to know that it's possible to leave, even when you think you can't, even when you've been out of the workforce for years, even when you don't have family support, even when you're afraid of what he might do. There are resources available, people who specialize in helping women escape these situations safely. You don't have to have it all figured out before you take the first step. If you're watching this and you're still in an abusive relationship, please know that you deserve better. Your children deserve to see what healthy relationships look like. It's never too late to reclaim your life, your voice, your sense of self-worth. I was 45 when I left. I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. Please leave a comment below and let me know if this story resonated with you. Share your own experiences if you feel comfortable doing so. Let's create a community of support for women who are healing from narcissistic abuse. And if you know someone who might need to hear this story, please share this video. Sometimes knowing that someone else survived can give us the courage to take our first step toward freedom. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories of survival and recovery. I'll be sharing resources in the description below. Hotlines, websites, books that help me understand what I was going through. Remember, you are stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and more valuable than he ever made you believe. Your story doesn't end with him. It begins when you choose yourself.